you very much, Glenn. And I just would like to thank you and Alfredo for the invitation to participate today with the Virtual School of Internet Governance. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today. And I would like this to be a conversation and a dialogue. So I'm happy to take questions as we go through, if there are any, or we can wait till the end. I'm fine either way. So if somebody has a question as I'm speaking and presenting, I'm happy to take those as we go. So yeah, just so by way of background, a brief introduction. Thank you, Glenn, for the details. I work for VeriSign. VeriSign is the registry operator for the .com and .net top-level domains. Also runs 2 of the Internet's 13 root servers and is currently performing the root zone maintenance function under an agreement with ICANN. I'm not here to talk about VeriSign today, but I just wanted to provide you a little bit of context in terms of my day job. My day job is very much engaged in the internet governance space and specifically in ICANN, but not exclusively ICANN. And we're going to go to a slide here next that was actually part of your homework and your background reading. So Alfredo, if we could move to the slide that has the circle of internet governance actors, that would be great.
Yeah, working on it.
Thank you. And I think I've been involved in the ICANN space and in the internet governance space for over 20 years now. And I have to say about just to note that the speakers that you have had and that you are going to have are really an impressive group of people, and I'm just thrilled to be among them and be able to acknowledge them. I'm Vince Cerf, Olivia Crepin-LeBlanc, Wolfgang Kleinbacher, Marilyn Cade, and looking forward to Steve Crocker and Bob Kahn. I mean, these are true leaders in the internet governance space and people that I've known for over 20 years now, and so I'm just really pleased to be a part of this, and just wanted to acknowledge the excellent group of people that Glenn and Alfredo have brought together for you. So I want to speak directly to the slide that's in front of us right now, and I know it's a little bit hard to read on the screen. I'm not going to speak to the specifics or the details, and I'm getting a little bit of background noise. If everybody could mute your lines, please. The graphic in front of us, this key actors in internet governance, you'll see that there are a number of different components. ICANN is one of them. And again, I'm getting some background noise. If people could mute your lines. Thank you. So you could see that you've got ICANN, IAB, IGF, IRTF, ISOC, W3C, the RIRs, IETF. These are independent and individual groups, but there is a lot of cross-pollination, a lot of interaction between the groups and among the groups, and you have individual participants that cross over into many of these different categories. For example, there are a lot of participants in the ICANN space that also are very active in IGF, and there are individuals who are both active in ICANN and the IETF. And so it's important to note that there is a tremendous amount of interrelation and activity and engagement across these various groups. And it's constantly changing and constantly evolving as new people come into the space, new individuals, new companies. And just wanted to note that this is a really informative and very helpful graphic. But these are not silos. These are different groups that have different purposes, as you see in the graphic. But there's a lot of cross-pollination and a lot of interaction among and between these groups. So with that, Alfredo, if we could move back to the slides that I sent you. Let me stop and see if anybody has any questions so far.
So Keith, I do have a question.
Okay.
When you saw the circle and the different constituencies or communities within the internet governance ecosystem, you mentioned that they are not silos. So I guess that there's some sort of interaction among them. Is there some sort of a meeting where they all get together and discuss issues, policies, regulations, and so forth?
That's a great question, Alfredo. Thank you. And I'd say the answer is probably not where all groups get together in a single space, but they contribute to one another more in a maybe perhaps a bilateral way rather than a multilateral way, if we can draw that analogy. And I'll give you an example here in a moment. But I would say that if there is one venue where many come together, it would probably be the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum. And the IGF really is, it is a multi-stakeholder engagement under the umbrella of the United Nations, but it is a multi-stakeholder engagement where groups come together and can talk about a wide range of issues. You'll have certain organizations that are focused on standards, such as the IETF. You'll have an organization like ICANN that we will speak about in a minute, focused on addressing, names and numbers, policies around addressing, and other groups that are focused in different areas. And IGF is the place where you will have the widest range of discussion topics, the widest range of issues that may be of interest to a range of different groups. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does, Keith. And as a follow-up, among the participants, we have June Paris, which was actually this morning in one of the consultation sessions with the MAG of the IGF. So welcome, June. And as Keith just mentioned, if you want to participate actively and learn more about the different communities within IGF, that's a place to go to. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alfredo. And that's exactly right. Yes, there's some important meetings of the multi-stakeholder advisory group in the IGF at this week. So very timely. So on the slide before you is a diagram depicting the ICANN organization and its multi-stakeholder model. And I'm here primarily today to speak to the ICANN organization and specifically the GNSO, which is the Generic Names Supporting Organization, which is the policy development body focused on generic top-level domains such as .com and .net. But I wanted to go back to the question that Alfredo just asked, and he said, are there, how do these different groups, if they're not siloed, engage with one another? And I want to point you to over on the right-hand side, there is a red box that says Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. So in the ICANN structure, in the multi-stakeholder model in ICANN, there is actually a formal role for the IETF through a liaison that basically participates and sits on the ICANN board of directors. So I think this is a really, sort of a depiction and an example of the fact that these groups have interrelation. And to get into a little bit more detail, it's possible under the contracts that ICANN has with its contracted parties, registries and registrars for domain name registrations, for standards to be developed in the IETF that could impact the contracts that ICANN has with registries and registrars. So it's more than just a nominal relationship, that there's actually important interrelation and interaction between IETF and ICANN.
So Keith, and I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in asking questions.
Sure.
So does that mean that ICANN gets a heads up when the IETF is working on some RFC, and they can, start a working group or a policy development consultation?
So thanks, Alfredo. It's a good question. And actually, ICANN has employees that participate in the IETF. In some cases, it's I think on behalf of ICANN, but in some cases, it's in their personal capacity because of their expertise and their experience and things that they happen to be focused on. And so I think through that liaison role, I would imagine that the ICANN board of directors would be aware of things that might impact the ICANN community and the ICANN responsibilities. But I think there is a lot of there are many examples of the two organizations working working on similar issues or related issues.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I want to focus a little bit. I want to focus your attention on the green boxes in the lower left-hand corner. We have the ASO, which is the Address Supporting Organization. We have the GNSO, the Generic Names Supporting Organization, and the CCNSO, the Country Code Names Supporting Organization. And the distinction, the importance of the supporting organizations, these three groups, is that they are the policy development bodies within ICANN. These are the three groups that are responsible for developing policy as it relates to IP addresses in the ASO, GTLDs in the GNSO, and CCTLDs in the CCNSO. And so this is an important distinction because these three groups are where the policy development work is made, where the multi-stakeholder model policy development is accomplished. Drawing the distinction to the three groups, the three red boxes to the right, are advisory committees. And these are advisory committees to the ICANN Board of Directors. We have the Root Server System Advisory Committee, or the RSAC. That's the group that focuses on the root server system, as it says. They provide advice to the ICANN Board of Directors through a board seat. They have a liaison to the ICANN Board of Directors. There is the Security and Stability Advisory Committee, that is the SSAC. They provide security and stability advice to the ICANN Board of Directors through a liaison that sits on the board. And we have the At-Large Advisory Committee, or the ALAC, which is the group that represents the at-large community through the RALOs, with a seat on the ICANN Board of Directors. And so it's, I think, an important distinction here that there is policy development work on the left, and there is advisory work to provide the ICANN Board of Directors with information and advice related to those policies on the right-hand side of this group. And so I just want to stop there and see if anybody has any questions about this. It's an important distinction in the ICANN space as to where policy is made and who provides advice to the board as the board considers approving the recommendations that come from the ASO, the GNSO, or CCNSO. Let me pause there for a moment.
Yeah, this is Bill Joris. It may be worth noting that the organizations that are in the ASO, the GNSO, etc., are what ICANN calls the contracted parties. That is, they have contracts with ICANN to administer the various top-level domain names, which is to say, being on the board of directors, there is a built-in massive conflict of interest there. We try and work around it, but there are some interesting basics of the organization that, if you're going to get involved in this, it's helpful to be aware of. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And contracted parties are certainly a component of the GNSO in that middle box there. It's the contracted parties are one of many participants in the GNSO, and the contracted parties have are under the ICANN bylaws are permitted to appoint one board member to the ICANN Board of Directors among the entire group of the Board of Directors. And just as the non-contracted parties in the GNSO are able to appoint one board member to represent their group, even while they're not actually representing the group formally, because they have fiduciary responsibilities to the organization while they're a board member. And we're going to actually speak a little bit more in detail about the GNSO in a moment. I have another slide that actually gets into more detail about the GNSO itself and the structure of the GNSO. Would anybody else like to ask any questions?
While somebody else raises their hand or writes a question in the post, I do have another question for you, Keith. So can any individual be a member of one of the ESOs, or are they vetted by somebody?
So thanks, Alfredo. Good question. Some of the groups have, I guess you would call membership requirements, and I think others are more open to participation and contribution. And it depends on your your interests and where you're coming from, and what your perspectives are. And we can talk more to that about the GNSO when we get to the next slide. And so, see if there's anything else. Yeah, I think we can probably move to the next slide now. We can always come back to this if there are any questions, but I guess the key here is that there's three different, three different policy-making bodies within ICANN, the multi-stakeholder community. It's the ASO for IP address policy, the GNSO for the GTLDs, and CCNSO for CCTLDs. And I think there's an important distinction, actually, between the GNSO and the CCNSO. As Bill mentioned a moment ago, in the GNSO, there are contracted parties, registries, and registrars that have contracts with ICANN, the organization, to perform its functions under the GTLD space. In the CCNSO, the country codes, they actually do not have contracts with ICANN. They have, in many cases, the CCTLD registries and operators predated the establishment of ICANN, and the CCTLD registries, by and large, do not have contracts or formal agreements with ICANN to perform the functions that they perform. And I want to take just a moment here. Actually, if we could go back one slide. Thank you, Alfredo. And this is an important point that I wanted to make, sort of a high level or a meta point, is that the multi-stakeholder model is evolving. It's not static. It's been evolving since its inception in ICANN. And in the early days of ICANN, there was not a distinction between the GNSO and the CCNSO. It was actually originally called the DNSO, the Domain Name Supporting Organization, that included both the Gs and the Cs. And it was only after, in the early days, a few years where going through one of the review processes, that the GNSO and the CCNSO were established, and the DNSO was split into two. And in part, that is because of this question of contracts. And the fact that the GTLDs became basically were placed under a contractual regime with ICANN, where the CCs essentially opted out of that type of an arrangement. And there is an important distinction here when we start talking about the multi-stakeholder model and policy development processes in the GTLD space, because there are processes, a formal PDP, a policy development process in the ICANN space, can actually change registry and registrar contracts. Typically, a contract is an agreement between two parties, a bilateral contract between two parties, where both parties would need to agree to any changes to that agreement. That's just typical contract law. In the ICANN community, and specifically to the GTLD registry and registrar agreements, in our contracts, there is actually an obligation, a commitment, that any policy recommendation approved by the board of directors that comes from a formal PDP, there is an obligation for contracted parties to accept those changes to their agreements. And there are certain things that are in scope and out of scope for a policy development process. The terminology there, if you hear it, sort of the vernacular, is inside and outside the picket fence. But it is a unique situation, a very, very unique situation, in that registries and registrars and ICANN, the contracts that we have, can be changed by the community through a formal PDP process. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. So this slide depicts ICANN's GNSO, the Generic Name Supporting Organization, and the structure that we have. And as Bill noted earlier, there are contracted parties, which is the group on the left-hand side composed of registries and registrars. And on the right-hand side, we have essentially the rest of the generic names policy development community. the non-contracted party house. So it's a bicameral structure with contracted parties on one side and others on the right. And the non-contracted party house includes commercial constituencies, which would be the BC, the business constituency, the intellectual property constituency, representing IP rights interests, the ISPCP, which is the internet service providers, the ISP's constituency, obviously providing the technical access to the internet. And then on the right-hand side of the non-contracted party house, we have the non-commercial constituencies, which is the non-commercial users constituency and the not-for-profit constituency. And so this is the structure of the GNSO, where policy is made for GTLDs. And it is essentially the way that the multi-stakeholder community in the GTLD space is structured. I want to note also in the upper right-hand corner, there are advisors, liaisons, if you will, to the GNSO Council from the ALAC, from the CCNSO, and actually there is another from the GAC. Since this slide was built, we've actually brought in the Governmental Advisory Committee. There's a liaison between the two groups there as well. And at the top of this is the GNSO Council, which is the body responsible for managing the policy process and managing the policy development work of the GNSO. I have been, up until October of last year, I was the chair of the GNSO Council for 2 years. I had been on the GNSO Council for a total of 5 years, and spent the last 2 of those 5 years as the chair of the GNSO Council. So I could talk more specifically about the GNSO Council, and happy to answer any questions that folks may have about the GNSO and the multi-stakeholder engagement in the ICANN space in this regard. So let me pause there, see if anybody has any questions at this point.
I do have a question, and this is Alfredo again. Sorry for asking so many questions.
No problem. No problem.
So how many members are on the GNSO Council in total?
That is a very good question, and I should have the answer to that handy. And I think it's 18, if I'm not mistaken. You caught me without the data.
No, don't worry. I think it's 18. I asked the question on purpose because I was wondering, since there's a contracted parties and non-contracted parties, is there a balance on the council when they try to reach consensus when a policy is delivered to them to consider?
So, yeah, thank you very much. So on the GNSO Council, there are 3 from each of the registries and registrars, counselors, so a total of 6. And you can see it's represented on this particular slide by the little yellow figurines in terms of the number of representatives from each group. So there's actually more representatives from the non-contracted party house than there are in the contracted party house. But the voting structure at the council level is based on you have to have a certain percentage of each house or both houses, depending on the nature of the actual recommendation that's been put forward. So if the GNSO Council is considering approving a recommendation that was developed in a working group, there are certain thresholds that need to be met that ensure the balance between the 2 houses rather than having it be simply a numerical difference. I hope that answers the question, but there is in the operating procedures of the GNSO, very specific and concrete requirements and steps as it relates to approving the recommendations. So perhaps we can go to the next slide, because this gets into process.
Oh, so, okay, Keith, before you do that, give me a second so I can answer a couple of, not questions, but comments in the chat.
Sure.
Kathy, don't worry about all the acronyms. We have in the course, we have 3 sources so that you can review all the acronyms. We have one from ICANN itself. We have one from Diplo, and another sort of glossary on terms and acronyms from GSMA. So don't worry about them. Just keep them in mind, and we actually explain them throughout the course in detail. So don't worry about that.
Fredo, may I jump in with a comment before?
Yeah, sure.
Starts? Okay, so I posted a tongue-in-cheek in the chat, because it seems like, due to the fact that you have these two, different groups, like we're not talking the same purpose. So just paraphrasing Winston Churchill, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So it seems to me that there's a natural tension, because the desires of certain policies could be driven by commercial interests versus civil society. So how do you deal with a policy that percolates up through the GNSO so that it actually works? I hate to see it similar to what's happened in the U.S. in terms of the conflict and within the House and the Senate, so that nothing ever gets done. So how do you see? What's your process of dealing with such a natural conflict?
Yeah, thanks very much, Glenn. And yeah, I've scrolled down into chat. And Kathy, you're absolutely right. There are so many acronyms in the ICANN space, and I apologize for not being more explicit. But I did note there is the reference that that Glenn and Alfredo mentioned in sort of the course documentation. If anybody needs me to clarify something, I'm happy to, and I'll try to spend a little more time without acronyms at this point. So Glenn, I'm going to answer your question, but also point to the slide in front of everybody now. There is a very, very structured process for developing policy recommendations in the generic name supporting organization. And it has multiple steps. It takes a long time. It can be a bit messy. But it is, essentially what we have now. When I mentioned earlier that, that the multi-stakeholder model is evolving, it's not static. It has evolved since its inception. It's an ongoing process of evolution, including recent changes made to GNSO operating procedures that we referred to as PDP 3.0 or Policy Development Process 3.0. It was essentially an evolution of some of the procedures that we use, and identifying things that didn't work well in the past and trying to identify how we can fix those for the future. A lot of it has to do with proper scoping of work, ensuring that proper representation is active in the groups, giving guidelines for working group chairs in terms of how to define and assess consensus and levels of consensus. And so I just wanted to note that this really is an ongoing process, and that in the ICANN bylaws, there's a requirement for the GNSO to conduct a review every 5 years. And that's something that's coming up in the next year or two in the GNSO, is a formal review of its engagement, its procedures, and how it works. So that's something. So I did just want to know that this is something that's evolving, and there are opportunities for people to participate in various parts of the ICANN community and its multi-stakeholder model, if you have the interest. And so in this particular slide, this really gets into quite a level of detail about the steps and the stages of developing policy. The early stage would be for an issues report to be requested. And an issues report could be requested by the GNSO, by parts of the community, by ICANN itself. The ICANN Board of Directors has the ability to initiate a formal PDP, policy development process, if it identifies something that needs to be addressed. The ICANN board historically, and I think today, is more reluctant to initiate a PDP on its own. They sort of historically, and I think today, feel like it's really something for the community to do. But the ICANN board does have the ability and the power to initiate a formal PDP in the GNSO. And a policy development process is conducted initially in a working group. a PDP working group with a chair and with representatives of the community, participants from the broader ICANN community, are essentially responsible for doing the actual policy development work. And through all of these steps, the output of a PDP working group would then finally, after it goes through an initial report, public comment, final report, it goes to the GNSO Council for consideration. And the GNSO Council would then essentially vote on the package that it is delivered. And traditionally, the GNSO Council is really supposed to vote on process and to approve a recommendation on whether the process was followed, not on the substance traditionally of the actual recommendations. The substantive work is intended to be done in the working groups itself. So, Glenn, to answer your question, the role of the council is really supposed to be focused on, did the working group follow its process and follow the procedures laid out in the bylaws and in the operating procedures? And if so, then the council is supposed to approve the recommendations to be sent to the ICANN board for its consideration. And in my mind, it's supposed to be, the intent is for it not to be political, it not to be contentious, to really for the GNSO Council to be responsible for certifying that the process was followed and that the recommendations are ready for consideration by the ICANN board. This is an important point, that in the GNSO, policy development results in recommendations. And those recommendations, once approved by the GNSO Council, go to the ICANN board for its consideration. The GNSO doesn't make any final decisions other than to say, yes, this package is ready for the board. Board, please either accept these recommendations, or if you have questions or concerns, you would return the package back to the GNSO for more policy work. So I know that was a lot, and I'm just going to pause. I think there's some questions in chat, but if anybody has a question, I'm going to stop here for a moment.
There's a question from Monica, and she's asking if you can please give an example of a past PDP that has been passed so that we can have a more concrete idea of how the process has gone through.
So thanks, Monica. It's a great question. And I can give you an example, a recent example that is related to GDPR and is related to the need for ICANN and the ICANN community to update its contracts with registries and registrars to ensure that those contracts are not in conflict with the GDPR. And so, and there's a little bit of detail here, but essentially ICANN issued a temporary specification now going back probably 3 years at this point, that basically said, because we can't force contracted parties to follow its contracts, and in violation of GDPR, we're going to issue this temporary specification. The temporary specification had a 12-month window during which time the ICANN community needed to establish a PDP. And it was actually what you'll hear referred to as an ePDP, an expedited PDP, that sort of accelerated the process. But essentially, this PDP group came together to try to figure out how to update ICANN's agreements with its contracted parties to ensure that the GDPR would be followed, but at the same time, access to WHOIS data, registration data for domain name registrations, essentially the phone book for who owns and registers a domain name, that essentially the group came together, and over the course of several years, worked on phase 1, which was replacing the temp spec, and then the phase 2 of the PDP, which was focused on developing a standardized system for access and disclosure to registration data. And now we're in the final phase of that, which is focused on something related to the distinction between legal and natural persons. I know this is a lot of detail, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but I'm going to boil this down to a situation where, on one hand, we have contracted parties that are required to follow law, and we had contracts because of historical because of the history, because of sort of historical reality, where contracted parties were required to display registration data. When GDPR came into effect with potentially significant fines for violation of GDPR, it was recognized that something had to change in those contracts. At the same time, there were groups and individuals very much reliant upon and interested in the data that was suddenly not available anymore, the data related to registrants, those who own domain names. And so there was a natural tension between the responsibilities of contracted parties, a new law coming into force in the European Union, and the fact that data that had been available for many, many, many years was suddenly not available anymore. The group had to come together in a multi-stakeholder engagement to try to find a path forward to ensure compliance with law, but also to provide a system that would be compliant with the law and also still allow access to that data. And it's been a long and challenging road for this PDP, because it's not an easy problem to solve. So let me stop there, and I should note that that the phase 2 of that work is still pending with the ICANN board. So this is actually sort of an active sort of issue right now. Let me pause, see if anybody has any questions or comments.
So Keith, following that example that you gave of an expedited policy development process, how long does a regular policy development process takes within the GNSO?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there's no like prescribed timeline. Some groups will conclude their work in a couple of years. We have other PDPs that have been ongoing for 4 or more years, and part of we recognized that in the GNSO work and the sort of the review and the evolution of the GNSO policy procedures, that we had to find a way to do a better job of keeping things moving, make sure that they are focused and targeted, and that the scoping of the group was done effectively, so it set the working group itself up for success. So the GNSO Council does the chartering and the scoping of PDP working groups. And once that charter and that scope is established, the groups then go off and work, and it's go off and do their work. And I think we recognized over the last several years that we could really learn from some of the past experience that was causing these groups to last far, far too long, to the point where you would have people contributing at the beginning, and then after a couple of years getting a new job and moving on, and you would lose a lot of the continuity, and it was causing more and more problems. So the GNSO Council now has new procedures and is approaching things differently than it had in the past to try to make the work more efficient and more effective.
Okay, so a follow-up question on that. I see that in the phases or the steps that are followed in GNSO, after the board approves the policy, the implementation phase, could there be some trouble because during the process of the policy development, rules can change? I mean, laws can come up, and then the board approves something that they won't be able to implement because now there's new regulations that they have to consider. Has that happened before, and what's your perspective on that?
So Thanks, Alfredo. Great question, and it's entirely possible that because of the length of time that the development of policy and then the implementation of policy can take, that things can change. I think you're absolutely right, and it's also possible that not only do you have changes to existing law. So, for example, in this case, this PDP that we initiated to deal with GDPR and the conflict with contracted party agreements, it's possible that something could change in terms of GDPR or something else in the European Union, but we also have the potential for new laws from different jurisdictions. That might be in conflict with one another or in conflict with the new policy. And so it's really one of the biggest challenges I think we in the ICANN community face, and in the GNSO in particular, because it has these contracts that need to be amended or made consistent with law. If we have multiple laws from multiple jurisdictions that are in conflict with one another, it creates a situation where contracted parties will at some point have to either choose where to do business or develop systems that have enough flexibility for the variability of multiple different laws and responsibilities based on jurisdiction, which is a very, very complex and potentially expensive challenge.
Yeah. So does anybody else have any questions, comments in the chat, or wants to have the mic? Glenn, I have to take care of some business for a couple of minutes, so I'll give you the floor so you can manage the discussion.
Great, thank you. I'm sure you had a lot of discussions with Dr. Stephanie Perrin, who's done a lot of really good work on WHOIS. How did you see, and again, I'm trying to understand this entire process because it's very linear the way it looks, but it must be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And like, I think you're giving me the impression that it's a very seamless process, but I guess that, and the reason I mentioned Stephanie, because she's very passionate on the WHOIS issue.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And yeah, Stephanie's been a very, very important and a great contributor to the discussions. Stephanie participates in the NCSG and the NCUC in the GNSO structure. I don't know if we want to go back to that or that page or not, but Stephanie's been, as you said, she's very passionate about privacy, and so I think the challenge that we have in the ICANN space right now on, for example, dealing with GDPR and eventually other similar or competing compatible or not compatible laws from other jurisdictions, is this tension between privacy and then access to data, right? And so on one hand, we have laws and expectations for individual privacy, and on the other side, we have groups that have legitimate interests as it relates to knowing who owns a domain name, and having had access to that data and now not having easy access to that data. And so it's about finding the process and finding the balance of these two essentially competing interests, legitimate interests on both sides, and that includes law enforcement, security researchers, intellectual property protection, in terms of the folks interested in access to data. And then, of course, we have the laws and expectations for personal privacy, and it's a natural tension. And the role and the job of the GNSO in this is to try to figure out how to thread that needle, how to find the right balance, and to make sure that the registry and registrar contracts with ICANN don't force those parties to in any way sort of either break a law or be in violation of its agreements, because then we have compliance problems with ICANN. So it's a real challenge, but it's the it's the work that we do. And Glenn, just to respond, it looks linear and it looks simple, and it is certainly not. There are challenges almost at every step here, but I think what's important to note is in a formal PDP that there is the opportunity at multiple stages for community members to provide their input through the working group, and then also a checkpoint for the GNSO and the working group to have public comment. So they put out an initial report seeking public comment on the work that it has done before it moves to the final report phase. And I think that's a really, really important part of sort of the ICANN multi-stakeholder model, and making sure that there's an opportunity for groups' work to be checked, and for the community to provide feedback and input to make sure that the work is being done in a positive and constructive way. But some of the PDP working groups can be very contentious because we have very different interests participating in the multi-stakeholder bottom-up consensus policy development. And it's actually one of the things, I think, that while a challenge, is one of the things that keeps ICANN and the ICANN multi-stakeholder model interesting, is because these are not easy problems to solve, and that we have various interests, all legitimate, but coming from different perspectives, and we have to find that balance. So let me pause there, see if anybody else has a question.
Just looking. Alfredo, is that you?
Yes, I'm back. So I don't know if you mentioned it, Keith, but how does the other supporting organizations do their PDPs?
Thanks, Alfredo. Great question. It's actually, I actually, in a previous job at a previous company, I was also a member of the CCNSO Council. This goes back many years now. But I was working in support of the .us CCTLD, and I was involved in the CCNSO. And it is a very, very different process. The CCNSO has a formal process for policy development, but it is different. And the output of CCNSO PDPs does not have the same requirements for changes to agreements, because there are no agreements between CCs and ICANN. So it is a different process, but they do still have a formal process. The CCNSO has actually just recently initiated its 4th PDP, which is focused on IDNs, internationalized domain names. And so that's actually just been initiated somewhat recently, I think in the last 6 months. And so if anybody's interested in policy development for country code names, there's actually one that's just been initiated that you could read up on. And then in the ASO, it's actually also an interesting situation, because the RIRs, the regional internet registries that manage IP addresses regionally, actually have a structure called the NRO, the Number Resource Organization, that sits outside of ICANN. Their presence in ICANN is through the ASO, the Address Supporting Organization, but they actually do most of their policy development work outside of the ICANN space. So it's a little bit of a different situation for the RIRs as well. But the GNSO PDP is very, very structured. It is included in either the ICANN bylaws, because it has a relationship to changing registry and registrar contracts potentially, or in the GNSO operating procedures. So it is a very, very formalized structure. And again, circling back to the reason for this level of formal sort of process, is that at the end of a PDP, registry and registrar contracts with ICANN can be changed. And the registries and registrars in our contracts are obligated and have committed to take on those new obligations or new commitments at the end of a PDP process that the ICANN board approves. So there are real world implications for the businesses of registries and registrars when a PDP is initiated, conducted and concluded.
Okay, Keith, there's a question here from Olivier from Senegal, and he was wondering if there's a redelegation process within the CCNSO, if that process also exists in GNSO, and how does it work?
So Olivier, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, in the CCNSO, the question of redelegation of names is a very, very important question for CCTLD operators and for the countries, frankly, of those CCTLDs. It's actually a very sensitive issue for the CC registry operators and, frankly, for the countries themselves, and it has pretty significant implications for those parties. In the GTLD space, the GNSO actually, because the registry and registrar, I should speak specifically to registries. Registries have the contracts with ICANN, and it's not a redelegation process in the sense that there's a formal policy that needs to be followed, because they are commercial agreements. These are agreements, these contracts are between the registry operator and ICANN, and a registry can decide to sell its TLD to another registry operator to essentially transfer that contract or transfer responsibility through commercial negotiations. And then there is a process for ICANN, to have to go through the contract change, to change the parties to the contract. But it's a little bit of a different situation because of that, because the Gs are based on commercial agreements and have contracts that are impacted. That's one approach. And in the CC space, it's essentially a question of, does the existing registry operator, who was originally given the name, presumably, many years ago, is there a question of redelegating that to someone else? And so they are different processes. Sorry, that went on a little bit long, but I wanted to make sure I drew the distinction. And I see Glenn has asked, are the GNSO sessions publicly available? They are. You can join GNSO council sessions or working group meetings. They are all publicly available. And if anybody would like to, contribute to the work in the ICANN space and the GNSO, I'd be more than happy to, help point folks in the right direction. I want to just note one sort of, a wrap-up comment for me. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. Is that, going back to the point that the multi-stakeholder model is evolving, and that's not just in the ICANN space, but it's broadly in the ICANN space. I should note that in 2014, the U.S. government and the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, announced that it was going to be essentially transitioning its last remaining sort of unique connection to ICANN and to the IANA functions to the ICANN community. Essentially, NTIA, the U.S. government, said, we have had a special relationship with ICANN for 18 years or whatever it was at the time. And it's now time for us to step back from that unique role to contribute to ICANN through the governmental advisory committee, as they always had, but basically be like every other government as it relates to ICANN. And so, NTIA and ICANN began a process in 2014 that took 2 years to transition the U.S. government out of its unique role and to hand responsibility for ICANN to the multi-stakeholder community. And through that process, we established something called the Empowered Community structure within ICANN that ensured that the ICANN community had some level of confidence that the ICANN board of directors wouldn't go rogue or wouldn't run amok. And so there was a structure, a very complicated and detailed structure put in place for the ICANN community to have some responsibility for its operation and some level of oversight, if you will, of the ICANN board of directors with the tools necessary to be able to hold the ICANN board of directors accountable if it in some way behaved badly. And so this was an important evolution of ICANN's multi-stakeholder model. And we're still implementing much of that today. And so there's constant change going on necessarily, because I think we all know that unless you evolve and adapt, you're not going to survive long, especially with new challenges facing us, especially in the ICANN space related to jurisdictional differences. When you have different laws and different jurisdictions and you're trying to apply a global policy for the policy work related to GTLDs in this particular case. And also, just to wrap up finally, we're also seeing evolution in the IGF. You know, the MAG meetings that are taking place this week, as well as the you know, the move potentially and likely from IGF to an IGF plus model. You know, the appointment of a digital envoy or a tech envoy. You know, a new high-level panel, perhaps. You know, so these are important developments and evolution. And I just wanted to sort of underscore that this is not static. There's an opportunity for change. Change is always required. And I think there's an opportunity for new contributors and new people to come into the space and to bring their views, their expertise, their perspectives to the discussion. I think it's critical for the multi-stakeholder model in general, including at ICANN, for new people to come in and, you know, to be there to contribute. So let me stop there. Glenn and Alfredo, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Keith. You know, one of the things you mentioned, IGF, and I forgot to mention it to all the participants today, that we're working with the IGF Youth, and we're looking at, and we had a meeting with the Polish government last week to have a pre-IGF Poland course for the IGF Youth, and so yeah, it's, you know, and I think this is important for everybody to realize, is that you have to wear a bunch of hats. In my case, as a former ISOC board member, involved with the Internet Society, I'm involved with ICANN, I'm involved with obviously with the Schools of Internet Governance and the IGF DC Coalition on Schools of Internet Governance. I think when you get down this rabbit hole, it can be quite consuming. But I have to say to people, if you use these terminologies and you get more and more into it, and I think especially if you find some mentors, I think that's the secret of this. And you know what, you guys are on the right path. And Keith, your presentation today, and I have to say, like what Jonah said in the chat, it was a fantastic presentation on the PDP process. In fact, I learned a hell of a lot. So I really appreciate. And I found out that you like sailing, so that's a plus. So over to you, Alfredo.
Yes, I have to agree with all Glenn's comments and congratulate Keith on behalf of Glenn and myself because of the excellent presentation you give on this important topic of policy development, and willing to answer all our questions on the fly, which it's astounding from your part. Guys, be aware that this presentation will be available in probably about an hour and a half in the site, then in the afternoon on YouTube and Facebook. And again, Keith, thank you. And I know you'll be around, so if anybody needs to get in contact with Keith, his email is within the course in this cohort, so reach out to him and ask him your questions. And please, please, please get involved in the internet governance ecosystem wherever you feel more comfortable. I myself started out as an observer a few years ago, and see where I am right now, involved in anything and everything in internet governance. So it's really up to you and your desire to change the internet governance ecosystem wherever you feel comfortable. So having said that, thank you all for your participation, and we'll keep in touch with Keith, and we'll see all of you next week. So bye to all. This meeting has
Thank you.
ended. Thank you.